So this session is basically to showcase two venture philanthropy funds recently set up in Hong Kong and Japan with the support from the AVPN community. And in the process of presentation, they will share their experience, how they define their mission, the vision and goals, as well as how to define the financial instrument to respond to the market needs, and how to identify the potential investees and the process of due diligence, and so on. And we have two commentators from the different the segment of the society. So we have the Lindy Lek, which is the Executive Director of Social Impact Partners, and the Tomoya Shiraishi from Social Investment Partners Japan to present their business cases. And we have James Chen, who is the chairman of the Chen Yat-sen Family Foundation, to provide his insight from the foundation or founder's point of view. And Andrew Muirhead, which is the executive vice chairman of AVPN, to provide his insight from his broad understanding of venture philanthropy industry in Europe and Asia. So we have a Q&A, time for the Q&A at the end of the session. So please feel free to ask any questions if you have anything. So let's start from the first presentation by Lindy. She will talk about her experience to set up a new VP fund at Hong Kong. So Lindy, please.
Hi. Good morning to everybody. I'm just going to share a little about how we got started. We're a pretty new fund, just really 10 months in operation. SIP is funded by foundations and private individuals, and also by institutional investors with a private equity background. The specifics of how we came, to developing our vision was presented in a fund document, and this was circulated amongst the funding members of the fund. And the sort of common vision that came out of that discussion is that SIP aims to change people's lives for the better through financial, human, and intellectual support for Hong Kong's social purpose organizations using the venture philanthropy approach. That is the aim of the fund. And for me, drawing on Mark Shoemaker's comment earlier, my aim is really to appear smarter, better looking, and funnier. This common vision really drove our investment strategy. And so you can see, we've prioritized education, youth, and employability as our sector of focus. But we do have a very wide investment mandate that allows us to explore opportunities in a wide range of, addressing a wide range of issues. Our objectives, the key objective, the primary objective, is to help SPOs scale up their proven models, also enterprises, social enterprises, addressing critical social issues. As venture philanthropy still suffers from a liability of newness in Asia, we feel also that it's important that SIP aims to prove the concept of venture philanthropy as an effective social investment strategy. And this is important to us in terms of the importance to our investors in the fund, but also important to the general social investment community in Hong Kong. Our progress to date, we're a closed fund of 15 million Hong Kong dollars. We have legal structures that are set up that allows us to do both grants and social investments. And we are supported by strategic partners across the key operational functions. In the 10 months that we've been in operation, we've reviewed 40 deals, 3 of which are progressing in due diligence, and 1 of them has recently been approved for investment. Non-financial support really is critical to the venture philanthropy model. And it's the critical ingredient that helps organizations become stronger, more robust, and more sustainable. These resources can be sourced from investors. A lot of our investors are keen to engage beyond a financial commitment. And we also use paid consultants and pro bono resources. The strategic partners that we have been helpful, not just in the startup phase of our fund. We also use them extensively in our due diligence of prospects, in deal structuring, and also in terms of implementing our investment strategies. And these resources can be developed through our network of the network of our investors, through their personal and also business networks. Generating deal flow. We started with a pre-launch market profiling to reach basically organizations that are existing, deal sources of deal flow that are existing, and also to reach untapped sources. We have cast our net very wide. We basically connect with existing foundations, with other social investors in the market. And our experience has been, with oftentimes the opportunities that have come up for other funds may not be appropriate for their investment mandate, but it may be exactly what we're looking for in our sweet spot. We also connect with consultants and also with industry groups. We have good relationships with Hong Kong Council of Social Services, Hong Kong Foundations Exchange, the Women's Network, the Women's Foundation, and other industry groups. But the experience we've had is, in order to generate this deal flow, one of them is very much to the need to articulate the benefits of an engaged funder relationship. This is particularly so in a market where the norm are still traditional grant givers. And also to provide a high level of early stage pre-application hand-holding of the SPOs to really get them to get to a position that they can access venture philanthropy funding. Assessing impact. The reality is organizations, SPOs in Hong Kong are still pretty early stage. As you heard in the earlier presentation, a lot of organizations are still focused on measuring their outputs in terms of number of programs, number of beneficiaries. We encourage the organizations that we work with to take a step back and to define their social outcome, the social change that they're trying to achieve. And hopefully that drives them to a better methodology in terms of measuring that impact. And SIP's funding is tied very closely to monitoring and reporting of these KPIs that track their progress towards their target outcome. And finally, as much as we expect our SPOs to track their progress versus KPIs, investors in SIP also track our progress as a fund through quarterly reporting on the areas of deal flow, development of network, capital deployment, co-investment opportunities, and the health of our portfolio. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop here. If there are any other questions, please raise them in the Q&A.
So, hello again. It's my second tour of duty here. I'm actually one of the initial investors in Lindy's fund, and you know, I got involved because I felt that this was a group, you know, in the Hong Kong ecosystem, you know. People think we're very sophisticated, and maybe so relative to other Asian cities, but certainly I think not to a world standard. The ecosystem is still not very well developed, and I saw that I felt that this fund would help to you know, add a very significant player into a space within the ecosystem that was not being addressed. Namely, kind of growth capital for these social purpose organizations. I think one of the key things that was brought also was actually the investors. And Lindy mentioned we actually have two of the top private equity funds who are based in Hong Kong as investors. And I think that's important. It's not about their money, but it's more about engaging those firms because, you know, in essence, a lot of what they do on their day job is very similar. They have a lot of skill sets that are very applicable to what we're trying to achieve on the social sector. And so that was one of the key benefits of having them as core investors. And I can say that they are very engaged, they're very on board, and I can see that they're also they are learning a lot about the space, and I'm very confident that these two private equity funds will become very positive contributors. I think that comes from Doug Miller's experience in Europe with the EVPA, where it was a couple of the private equity people who helped to catalyze, you know, the impact in Europe. For my personal story, I'm, you know, before joining SIP as an investor, I had set up my family's foundation, and the key, you know, and I think we operate in the venture philanthropy space as a funder. You know, I think we're very specific in that we're very early stage. You know, as we said, we're very, you know, we are very focused, but on an issue. It's about domain expertise, and it's about taking risk, and it's about failing. But you know, what's important is that is really the way that we organize ourselves. I think is what is certainly in the Hong Kong context, and perhaps even an Asian context, is somewhat unique in that, you know, we have a governance structure. I think that creates the kind of decision making and support that really helps our process and our outcomes. And by that I mean is that, you know, we have a structure in the foundation where we have a board of directors. What's key is that on our board, unlike a lot of other family foundations, there's 7 members of our board, of which only 3 are family members. We have 4 non-family members, and that has been one of the most important things for us, is that having these non-family members has helped in a couple of very important ways. Number one is these non-family members help to bring a lot of kind of the experiences that are outside. When you're family members, you tend to have somewhat of a closed circle of experience. And by having these non-family members, we'll be able to extend our understanding of the world, you know, the larger environment in a much better way. There's a very subtle thing also, is that having non-family members keeps the discussions to be much more civil. If you're only family members, you start getting easily caught up into family politics. Having non-family members helps to, kind of focus the family members towards, what we're trying to achieve and not about, our own internal rivalries, etc. And then, but what's important is that having seen some of other family, there are some family foundations, even in Hong Kong, who have on the board only non-family members, and I think that's a huge mistake, because what happens in those kind of organizations is that it becomes a principal agency problem. In what I mean by that is that when you have only non-family members, those people who are charged with making and approving decisions, they are guessing at what the risk tolerance of the family is, the tolerance for failure. And so, my observation is that they will tend to, not knowing, what the family really, does the family really, how much they care about their reputation. If something fails, would it be embarrassing for the family and so forth, right? So they're guessing, and so they will tend to not take the kind of risks that's necessary to be effective. And so having the mix of both family members and non-family members is one of the most important lessons I've learned in setting up our family foundation, because you have the best of both worlds. You need to have family members who are engaged, who understand what's going on, that when decisions are made, they understand the risks that are being taken, and that they also, importantly, is that it's not a rubber stamp board, that these outsiders also feel that they should speak their mind, and the atmosphere has to be like that. But having those outsiders really brings the quality of the discussions, and I think ultimately decision making, to a much higher level. Now, I think that's something that I see replicated in Lindy's board, because all the funders are actually on the board, and so we have skin in the game, but we're also engaged, and so we understand. So whatever decisions are being made, there's a comfort level with the staff as well as with the board and everyone engaged with it, that it's the funders who are willing and have the appetite to take that kind of risk. So with that, I think I'll pass it on.
Okay, thank you very much, Lindy and James. We had a very interesting illustration of the case in Hong Kong, how the funds are set up with support from private equity community. And as you understand that, if we capture venture philanthropy as application of venture capital principle into the philanthropy, they nicely utilize these resources, as well as the engagement with the board members, which is usually funders to the fund. And James also mentioned how we can increase the quality of a board discussion to get a more sophisticated decision-making process as a fund. Okay, so shall we move on to our speaker from Japan, Mr. Tomoya Shiraishi. Maybe he will introduce himself briefly in the beginning, but before he set up this organization. He has been in the private equity industry over 30 years. Yes, and he used to be a head of the leading European private equity firm. So maybe you, from the presentation, I think you will see that how he fully demonstrate his capability as a private equity professional into the philanthropy field. Okay, then Shiraishi-san, please.
Thank you, Ken-san. My name is Tomoya Shiraishi, Social Investment Partners. Our company's name stands for SIP also, as Social Impact Partners. We have no formal relationship However, except that both of us was born by the efforts of AVPN network, and I like to touch upon our activities in the past 3 years. Would you flip to the next page? Thank you. Thank you. This is our observation about SPO market, social enterprise market in Japan. Among around 50,000 SPOs in Japan, most are struggling in small scale. Their annual budget is about $100,000 to $500,000 a year. And there are few SPOs that maintain sustainability to maximize their social impact. And existing supporting organizations, including foundations, focus on relatively earlier stage in small amount and spreading their investment and grants to so many grantees. And their granting program is usually based on for a single year basis. CSR is the biggest player in Japan too, but usually still focus on specific sector or field of assistance in view of their corporate strategy or PR activities. Individual pro bono is still based on a volunteer space and ad hoc. So we thought it was coincidence just after the earthquake in Japan. We recognized that there is a very strong demand for long-term financial and managerial support with a good sound governance to those SPOs. Who we are? We are VP organization founded in 2012 by 7 business sector veterans, including myself. I have a private equity background about 30 years now. I'm getting 52 years old this year. Our colleagues are averaging more than 20 years experience in VC, private equity, and corporate finance. We manage our first fund called Japan Venture Philanthropy Fund in the amount of 150 million yen with Nippon Foundation, which is the largest private foundation in Japan. Our external donors are business professionals, including myself and colleagues, and business owners and corporates. And the Nippon Foundation commit one-to-one matching to those external donors. We focus on so-called development stage rather than those startups or early stage. SPOs with proof of concept and some track record to expand those their social impact. We also have a pro bono organizational commitment from professional firms. They invested more than 1,000 hours in aggregation so far. They are quite expensive people, as you know, probably $500 to $1,000 an hour. So this is a quite investment from them too. This is, of course, not a volunteer base, but they are charging them as in the normal business hours. Bay and the company, our friends, Strategy Consulting, Clifford Chance, Legal Counsel, Vox Global Japan, which is the affiliated firm with Omnicom Group, subsidiary actually of Fleischmann Hillard. They are specialized in the communication consulting, which is including risk management communication and also advocacy and sometimes lobbying to government and politicians. We believe this kind of communication, especially advocacy things, is quite important to enhance those SPOs activities. One international accounting firm joining soon this year. We do thorough due diligence to identify and measure social impact. We always utilize the theory of change model, and we try to find what is a leverage point. And we also look after the logic model. What is the output and what is the outcome? And in the short-term outcome to mid-term outcome and long-term. Our main selection criteria is innovation and measurable social impact and its scalability, sustainability as an operation, and good management team. Sometimes, of course, management team is not adequate when we invest. So we try to mold the team together to execute the business plan we agreed at the time of due diligence. We not only to do the evaluation, actually our due diligence is more molding the business plan with potential investee management and to design the support plan in terms of financial and also managerial support. We have now 2 portfolios. One is after-school operation and also Teach for Japan, which is the group firm of Teach for America, Teach for All. It's been 2 years now since we invested into after school. They are doing operation of after school mainly for elementary school kids from 7 years old to 12 years old. They achieved a 3-year business plan by 1 year ahead. It is a quite rare experience in my private equity venture capital investment. And number of schools and beneficiaries has grown by 3 times. By the way, it's been now, they were established about 10 years ago. So they have not so much grown for the past 8 years. Then after our investment, they have grown about 3 times now. And they started the operation, not only the private school they did, but also public school based on their best practice. In order to do this kind of operation, expand, they could grow the revenue also. When we invested, their revenue is about $400,000. It's now about $2 million annually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiraishi-san. And we have Andrew to comment. As you know from his background, he has very interesting cross-sector career development. He started from as a banker, and he moved to this corporate foundation, and the corporate foundation which actively utilized the VP methodology. And eventually he came to join us as executive vice chairman to evangelize the methodology of venture philanthropy. So I expect that Andrew's insights from the different sector experience. So please, Andrew.
Thank you, Ken. No pressure. That's a very generous introduction. I tend in my career to fall into things as I go, so there's not quite the progression in planning that maybe your introduction suggested. I'm going to try to be quite brief, and that's not always easy for me to be. Because I think it'd be great to hear some things and some questions from the audience. Ken particularly asked me to cover off governments and venture philanthropy, and I'll come to that in a moment or two. But following the brief that's provided, I think vision and objectives, and I think we've had really good presentations. maybe I came to venture philanthropy formally. I may have been practicing it before in a foundation, I think, but I came formally through maybe a slightly unusual route. My frustration was with the conduct of funders. And I mean funders of foundations, high net worth individual philanthropists, and governments and whoever, taking way too short-term a view and way too fragmented an approach to key social issues. And what that on the ground was producing was so many social entrepreneurs and NGO leaders spending most of their time raising money and dealing with the bureaucracy that surrounded the money they were raising. And I didn't think the funding world was actually being terribly supportive to social impact. So that's what brought me to the front door. I spent a year in 2006 traveling and spent time in Australia, the US, Europe, and Asia, looking at different models. So I guess I can never remember where all of the influences came from. That's a function of age. I hadn't realized we were going to have to give our ages. I'm 56, nearly. And I'm taking a more active interest. My next venture philanthropy fund is going to be an aging, enlightened self-interest fund, we're going to call it. But everything starts from somewhere, and as I say, I started from the more of a funding aspect, and but then it does move very much to being very clear about the sector and the issue you want to address. One of the smartest things we did in the early stages of the funds I created in Scotland was to outsource the baselining of the social issue that we felt was most pressing. And we also had identified before doing that likely collaborative funding sources. And we got them to contribute their knowledge and their experience and their perspectives to that baselining exercise. And in doing that, what we created was a neutral platform that created the opportunity for collective action. So I think in the early stages of a venture philanthropy fund, a baseline and building a common understanding amongst those that you anticipate will be involved in it, both from an investing or a donating end, but also from an investee end, is very important. I'm just going to run through and throw up things that perhaps will help questions. We've heard a lot about human capital, and we had various kinds of human capital that we used to carry out due diligence, to carry out the creation or the formation of the fund and the investees of the NGOs and social purpose organisations we brought into the fund. And the first fund we had 24 investees, and we aimed to raise 100 million sterling over 10 years to support the programmes and so on. So there was paid for human capital, but there was another bit of human capital I think is important, and I don't know if I've heard it yet, to emphasise, and that was around about the due diligence process. I think most people can do some of the harder levels of due diligence, the skills, and assess the entity that's coming forward. But we also looked very closely at the models and the issue, the sector, social issue matters, and alongside we run a parallel process of due diligence and the ability of an organisation to deliver as we would see it, and also the model that they intended to use and the social programme they were going to run. And we had a super group of volunteer pro bono advisors on the issue area that we ran separately and in parallel and had to bring together. So I think that type of human capital was very important to us. I could say a lot more things, but I'd rather come out in questions and discussion later. But Ken asked me specifically to talk about the governmental aspect. From a pretty early stage, I realised that government were always a very key, in most countries of the world, were a very key partner, or a very key potential partner, but were often outside of the venture philanthropy world. Governments are usually the deepest pockets, but that's not the real issue. It's about policy and influence. And as a partner, both at the beginning, where you're trying to understand the dimensions, demographics, and so on, their knowledge is vitally important. But for me, the holy grail for venture philanthropy and for philanthropists is to move to scale. And government, for me, in so many places, are the potential scale agent. So getting them involved in the funds we created, they were an investor alongside high net worth individuals and alongside foundations on exactly the same basis and the same terms. It was all donated funds, if I can use terms in that context. But getting them in was very important to bring their expertise, but also to ensure that what we were learning through the delivery of the social enterprises and ventures in the portfolio was feeding back into policy. But why were government interested? They were leveraging other resources. The proposition I made to them was that for every pound they provided, we would match that with £2 or £3 more, which was an important one. But also leveraging skills, leveraging capacities. I get very boring when I talk about tri-sector and the need to bring government, private sector, and the social sector together. But I fundamentally believe if you're going to address complex and challenging social problems, that's very important. And I think also government, we talked earlier, I think it was mentioned even in the first session, sometimes the barrier to engagement is perceived risk and so on. I think that by giving leverage, you actually help to lessen the risk, and you can sell a level of risk, and you can allow government or permit government to become more innovative through those partnerships. And I talked about short term. You can bring government into longer term funding mechanisms by syndicating term. What I was saying was, if we all put a small percentage of our resource into a common platform, a venture philanthropy fund, we can take a longer term view together in a way that we couldn't do individually. And the final thing I'll say about government, and the final thing I'll say before we go to questions, is that governments the world over are desperately keen to try and move spend their money from acute services and dealing with problems back upstream, or I never know whether it's upstream or downstream, just excuse me, but into more preventative types of approach. And those can be very difficult, and I think that is a sweet spot for me for venture philanthropy, particularly around about the disciplines of measurement and understanding outcomes and so on. I think that venture philanthropy as a proposition to government is about, let's try to find things that we can do today that save significant resources and also make people's lives better. That's the downside of being a banker. You always forget about people and you get caught up in models and money and things. But how do we make things, do things today that make people's lives better in the future, but also actually relieve pressures on spending pots? So these are some of the propositions that I think relate to government in the creation of venture philanthropy funds. I couldn't stop speaking without saying one final thing. There is a publication, if you don't already have it or have downloaded it, an AVPN publication on how to establish a venture philanthropy fund, which I would guide people to. And there's legal aspects from 6 different Asian countries reflected in that publication. Thank you.
Excuse me, can I make an observation, I think, before we get to questions?
Yes,
because
please.
I think this is, and forgive me if my wife always says, you're too Western and you don't really understand, Chinese culture, so I shouldn't really be commenting on this. But one observation, we're talking about social impact and enabling and catalyzing change driven by individuals in societies, right? I mean, that's what we're all talking about here. But as something different from Western society to Asian society, and in particular Chinese and society, with Chinese society, one observation I have is that we come from a culture where there's a very, this Confucian ideals, there are Confucian ideals, and very much it's about, you have roles in society or what you're supposed to do. So, as a merchant, you do, if you do well, yes, it's your role to support charity. Like in the village, if there's a flood, then, you as the wealthy family, you got to set up a stall and hand out rice and all that. That's charity. But when it comes to social change, that is not the role of private citizens. This is something that governments are supposed to deal with. And you see that manifest itself particularly in a place like China, where the government, the controlling party, feels that is their legitimacy, as expressed through their agents, the civil servants, to do social change. So, the thing that I'm trying to point out is that, I think in Asia, or particularly in Chinese society, and I think it's the same in Japan and other Indian, I see people not, it's very with the value systems, we have that additional headwind that at least now is not an issue in Western societies, and probably in the group here, those of us who have been educated abroad, we've gotten the kind of the brainwashing that yes, of course, you see something wrong, you deal with it, you support it, whatever, you make the change. But I think from our larger society, from the government's perspective, it's still very much that those that, as donors, oh yeah, people are very generous, they want to write checks, but, actually figure out how to solve the problem, that's not what we're supposed to do, And, I think I would say the significant majority of funders still work under that value system, right? And hence the challenges that we face as people trying to make this change. And so I would put that out there, and also, and please, challenge this or comment on it as you will. But this is fundamentally I think something that's different that we face in Asia that isn't faced by other societies, particularly the Western societies.
Thank you for the great comment. Before jumping to the Q&A, I want to ask two of the presenters related two questions each. This is the same question for two presenters, Lindy and Shiraishi-san. And one question is that how do you see the funding gap? That because you are doing a due diligence of all the different organizations, and I think you will find some segment of organizations need a funding from venture philanthropy type of funding, the funding source. And who are they? And why these private or public funding doesn't reach to them? So that is my question, one question. The other question is related to James' comment, the relation with the VP fund and the social systems, maybe let's say the government systems. And some people, I know that some people is the saying that VP is to create a prototype of a public systems, which has not been achieved by the existing government system. And make some innovative models to show that how it works, and eventually government or the market will take that into their system. So do you see such kind of dynamism going on in Hong Kong or in Japan? And how do you see this potential power of the philanthropy sector to influence the social system? So this is second question. So you can answer either one or both of the questions. So please, Lindy.
I'll take the first question. Well, before I do that, I happen to have a copy of the product plug that Andrew had referred to. Very useful. I would refer to that. Unfortunately, we didn't get to use it very much because it was published after we were set up. So, but that's the publication that was mentioned. On the first question about the funding gap, I think what we've seen is the part, it was referenced in the earlier discussion as well about giving funding that is unrestricted. And I think that is where we've seen a lot of value in what we do. We go in to organizations, and the conversations seem to point that it's easy to get funding in Hong Kong. It's not a lack of funding. That is not the issue, but the traditional funders and the existing sources of funding tend to be focused more on programs. People want to fund programs that they can put their logo on and get some kind of publicity from. funding that is coming from venture philanthropy that tends to be focused on development of the, building the capacity of the organization. That's what's in short supply. And SIP has prioritized that in terms of our focus on the type of funding that we would do.
Okay. About the first question, I touched upon some, sort of a death valley of the small caps, small size enterprises, and in terms of those stage, and probably the other point is the existing foundations or governmental support or grants is usually for the more, how to use basis or expense basis rather than the, future outcome-oriented one. So more sort of, investment-oriented viewpoint, what is not only what will be spent for the money, by the money, but also what is the outcome for the future. And in order to achieve that outcome, we need not only financial, but also managerial support or capacity building and those. So those kind of some investment kind of return-oriented or outcome-oriented mind is really the gap. And the second point is you mean the governmental role? Okay. Let's see. Historically, I agree that that in case of Japan, we believed that the government has a tremendous role to solve the social issues. And as the economy or society is matured, and we have now aging population and decreasing the birth rates, and our community is sometimes collapsed. And then usually government is very good at the problem has already occurred or for the something for the urgency needs. We or the more commercial people is quite good at to grasp those kind of needs in advance to do a more procurement kind of approach. I think that is an innovation. And sometimes good social entrepreneurs has a good innovative approach before the regulators or government has stepped in. So sometimes VP's exit is not only scaling up of the size, but also scale out. Or if the government is touched upon and stepped in that social issue, then this is a quite happy exit for the NPOs. So I think this is not only the matter of the role or the culture, and when the society is more matured, then we need this kind of some good ecosystem. And in case of Western countries, I think they are very good to do those kind of standardization of the VP model or venture capital model. And we sometimes can utilize those kind of method to each country's localize those kind of a standardized model.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to take the question from the floor, and we have our volunteer Julia to hand you the mic. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Anyone from the floor? Oh yes, please. Then.
Leon Cheung from the Hong Kong Jockey Club. So the speakers talk about how we measure deals, how successful those deals are, and also focus on outcome instead of output. My question is, from a foundation's perspective, then how do you measure the foundation's success? Lindy obviously put up a few KPIs, but as we see, if I may very directly, those KPIs are also more output driven. instead of outcome driven. So from a foundation's perspective, then the question is, how do you then measure sort of foundation's impact on the community, on the society? Thank you.
Well, from SIP standpoint, we don't measure across the portfolio. These are very much driven by the SPOs that we invest in. So that drives very much, depending on the type of organization, and we do have a pretty wide mandate in terms of investments. We work with both nonprofits and also, to the other end, commercial ventures that have a social impact. So it would be unfair, and it would be difficult to measure it across and to compare all the SPOs across the board. So in terms of our funders or our investors' view on each organization, that will be part of the discussion in the portfolio health. So that wouldn't be, the portfolio health would be looked at based on each project that we commit to.
Can I answer from I think this is an interesting thing, because again, we're touching on the issue of really about ultimately it's about accountability, right? Because what we keep saying, we're going to take lots of risks, there's going to be lots of failures, and the issue is, different donors have different, I think, capacities for accepting failure and risk and then failure, right? And people can theoretical risk, but when things start to fail, that's when the rubber meets the road, right? And people head for the exits and start coming. But and that's why I feel that it's super important today that families are family foundations in particular are set up in the right way, as I mentioned earlier, where families, because family, I think, can have much higher tolerance for risk and failure if they understand what, if they're passionate about what is it that they're trying to, change, right? Make the change in, and they see something that, hey, this is a good idea, but nobody's done this. We should try it, and if it fails, it's our money. We know we're fine. We don't care. There's no reputation. If you go to corporates, if you go to governments, who are the other two key kind of donors, right? I mean, there's always that fear of, I think, the Shell people, I think I applaud them for having the perseverance. But I think a lot of corporates and particularly governments would really have a hard time keeping the course, right, and accepting the failure and learning from failure. I mean, we're not in there just to do things and see them fail. Failure to me, there's two different types of failure, right? There's a failure because there was some kind of a problem, like fraud or a bad failure. And then I think there's for us is the good failures are the ones there was a theory of change, a hypothesis, and it turned out when you actually tried to do it, it didn't work out. That to me, for me is good failure, because that person, that entrepreneur who tried and failed, he learned something, and he can reapply that. Hopefully, in fact, we would continue to want to be engaged with that person, with that group, as long as they can tell us what was wrong and what's next. How can they learn from their mistake and then continue, right, towards the desired outcome.
Thank you very much. Andrew, do you have anything to add from your foundation experience?
No, I just loving the way the conversation was on failure. There's a recent publication. I'm not just selling publications; these are free, okay? Recent publication by EVPA that looks at 10 venture philanthropy funds in Europe and learns from failures in those publications. And the reason I mention it is that I get more features in there than I might want to have. And in fact, Doug Miller is wanting to get me a new business card and call me head of failures for EVPN. So failure is good, and you're right. And for me, it's about learning from those failures. And if you can learn from other people's failure's great. Picking up in Ken's point, the foundation that I ran, we had 500 grantees or investees across 20 different types of social themes. So trying to evaluate that foundation was impossible. We could evaluate some of the more relationship between us and donors and so on aspects, but that was quite difficult. So when I evolved a venture philanthropy fund, or the first one out of there, getting some sort of framework on the evaluation was important, or understanding the outcomes. And by choosing a social issue and baselining it carefully, part of that baselining was actually to identify what the evaluation model might look like and what the outcomes of that work might be. And we worked on the basis of aggregating the 24 social ventures so that they were all reporting in a common framework that ultimately led through to 3 big things: the number of jobs created, the number of training places people were in, the number of it was a 14 to 19-year-old series of social programs, and the number of those who were still in education age that were getting back into education and working well within that setting. And those outcomes were very important because they were simple outcomes that we could express to the people we wanted to provide money to the fund and so on. There was a whole raft of other outcome measures there, but I guess the journey I had from foundation to venture philanthropy was about taking something that maybe not everything needs to be evaluated, not everything needs to be measured, not everything needs to be, and it's important to emphasize that. But in areas where you're trying to create some systemic change, it's important that you build that in very early in the planning.
If I can add, as the collaboration case between foundation and venture philanthropy organization, we are co-managing the fund together with the Nippon Foundation. I think it's all right to take a output if it is right KPI to leverage as a leverage point for the future theory of change. And as I have shown the ecosystem, there are various kinds of small and medium-sized social enterprises needs some small amount and grants from those foundations. And then Nippon Foundation, for example, has I think more they grants of more than 200 to 300 SPOs a year. Then when those became a little bit the middle stage for the expansion, then our funds will invest those kind of stages. So I think this is a more ecosystem to share the role between the venture philanthropy and foundation. So coming back to your question, I don't think always that the outcome can be the KPI. Sometimes output can be the KPI too, but we have to analyze which that is a right KPI for the total theory will change.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope these comments answers your question. Is there any questions?
I'm Tilly Feng from Chengdu, Sichuan province of China. I actually have a question for James. You mentioned the government role in China's society. I remember you mentioned in the morning in the panel you have a library in Hefei. more than 20 libraries there, and I believe that program make great contribution to the people's reading habit, and that's a great contribution there. So I'm wondering whether during this program, is there a government officer or any government to work with that in that program or take part in that program, or you are looking forward anything for the government to get involving, because you think make the social change is to some big extent depend on the government. But I believe the companies and these foundations, all the organizations, or even general public in the society, they are the really people to make the social change. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Yes. In fact, you know, the schools we work with are all the government schools. So that was very important to us that we have these ideas, and you can say they're foreign or not. We took the best ideas we could find, and we understood that we had to translate it to the local context, and that we couldn't do it since we were outsiders. So finding Principal Xu-Mei, who when I first met her, a lot of people say a lot of things, but she actually did it, right? And so I was very impressed with her, and she, and so we continue to deepen our engagement. But I think what's important is that through that process, all of our these ideas, these best practices, these concepts became localized, and it's being translated into ideas that the local, she herself now, as I said, she's become an education bureau, district official. So it's being brought into the system, that those things that we're doing, that just cannot be accepted, they're rejected, right? But those things that can be, she's saying, what's interesting is that in the China context, so our thing is we just created, a model of how it can work, and it does work in China, okay? But in still a very small scale. Now the issue is, ultimately is the scalability, how to get that. We don't have the resources, it will be my if we did it ourselves, it will be my grandchildren's generation before they make a larger dent in this, right? But what is happening is that the central government, I think this year, recognized, free reading for children as something that is an educational priority. So all of a sudden, we're getting, it's like we're at the grassroots level, and all of a sudden, right at the top, as you know, in China, once something is said at the top, all of a sudden you don't believe the amount of interest we have in what we're doing. Even from the mayor of Hefei, all of a sudden makes a visit and says, "Wow, this is happening in my city. This is wonderful." And I'm sure it starts to filter up into the system. And the library in Beijing, the children's section all of a sudden has a lot more money, and they are extremely interested in cooperating with us. And so, well, I didn't know this. We didn't know that, Premier Li and Xi Jinping would all of a sudden, highlight this as an issue. But because we've been working at it for 8 years, and so, but now, we can see that we have a model that is really a Chinese model that we think can be scaled up locally, So our what we should, what we'll do is we continue to try to support it in ways that make sense, but increasingly we can withdraw, and let the locals, continue to scale up. I hope. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to come in as well and reinforce the point that James made very well in terms of governmental context. And all the ideas must sit within the context that where you're operating. And I don't think that is restricted to China, the pushback. I can think of Scandinavian countries in Europe where everyone looks to the government for social provision, and there is no culture or very little culture of things coming from outside of there. But even in those parts of the world where there may be a more amenable government, it's still a fairly early stage, and it's not universal. One of the hardest things I found in creating Inspiring Scotland was to get cross-sector buy-in from even from the board of Inspiring Scotland. That not everybody respects the other sectors. People from business sector, government sector, social sector. The ground that I was trying to play on was where mutual respect existed. And that wasn't universal. I mean, government particularly are viewed as bureaucratic, cumbersome, unwieldy, will drive the agenda in their direction, and so on. That was being put up to me quite a lot, particularly those from a business background, and those from a social sector background as well. But when you find those leaders and role models and people within each of those sectors that get it and can actually find respect and find common ground, I think it is a real goal to aim for, and a real sweet spot that we were maybe lucky to find. And so those reservoirs of mutual respect are really where you start all of this and you work out from there. But it's where you are and you deal with the world you're in.
I just wanted to ask you about failure, which everyone has touched on as being a very important part of the learning process, and focus on due diligence. I mean, how much importance is there in due diligence in looking at a potential investment? And if you complete due diligence with, ideally, you shouldn't fail, right? So the importance of the funders, the board, in the case of SIP and SVP, and how engaged are the board members in terms of monitoring and being involved with the venture that you're funding, and at what time would you actually inject your opinion and stop a mistake from happening that you can predict, rather than let them fail? I mean, it's just like a parent watching their child about to do something that they regret, but maybe learning by making that mistake is more important. And how do you make that distinction?
I think the due diligence process is critical in identifying what those risks are. And in terms of your question on when do you let things fail, hopefully, we see ourselves as IP as being, part of the team once we've, committed to supporting SPO. So even though, there are KPIs that are pre-agreed, tracked, and monitored, it's twofold. One, that is really to encourage the organizations to track the right KPIs so that they can improve on their operations and be a better SPO. But the other reason for doing that is also that they know what is important to us, and before you reach a point where you have to make a difficult decision, hopefully you already have that quality of relationship with the organizations that you support, that you're not going to, hopefully you're in the process and working with them to resolve those issues or problems before they become, a difficult conversation.
Yes, in case of our SIP, experience only still 3 years, so a little bit early to say. But in my venture capital experience, my first fund is always better than second one. So I think we need some failure sometimes to learn from the experience, and not to be afraid the failure itself, but how we should learn from the failure is more important things. Having said that, in order to prevent the future failure, we have two kind of things in the due diligence. One is we try to mold the business plan together rather than evaluating the given papers or given business plan. We need very, very patient approach to them in that sense, because sometimes those management doesn't have a concrete roadmaps or business plan. They sometimes have only the input and future outcome. Our role is to guide and mold the business plan together with them. So sometimes we take, the mentoring period for the 6 months to 12 months, occasionally. Then we start the due diligence. So in order to do the due diligence, we have some, pre-running period as a mentor. Second thing is that our sort of outcome of the due diligence is the business plan we agreed. We always have, of course, a scenario analysis. So we have some, negative scenario and a neutral and optimistic. And in case of a negative scenario, what kind of things we should do, or what kind of a risk management we should do, is an important thing. So usually we take this kind of two approach. One is taking some time long to mold the business plan together, then prepare some few scenarios, especially focus on the risk management. Our role as a board is, in case of our board is a quite, close relationship in terms of the due diligence and post-investment period too, because they are also one of the major donors, and also they are the board of our SIP, and they are inviting their relations of the corporates or business owners to our donation funds too. So they are doing also the fundraising. So utilizing their own some business background or experience, they sit on the due diligence, or sometimes they are doing those mentoring things too. Then in case of post-investment, they share the board seat of the investee company, investee SPOs.
Just to add to that, our experience in Hong Kong is, in terms of setting up our fund, these investors in the fund are critical, particularly, organizations that have, like James's foundation, that has the expertise in a particular sector focus. That's where we draw a lot of the resources from. And also, in terms of the other investors in the fund, the private equity supporters, they bring with them, a large business network that we can leverage into pro bono resources. That just allows us to run, sort of more lean and mean, and every dollar that we raise in the fund can be more effectively used to benefit the end beneficiaries, the SPOs.
Yeah, just to pick up on very good question on due diligence, and I'll use from practical experience. In due diligence, we developed a two-sided risk assessment tool. On one hand, you're assessing the delivery or the operating model, theory of change, whatever you call it, the model of the investee or the potential investee. So you're assessing the risk in that model. On the other axis, you're assessing the risk of that organization and the ability to have a relationship with that organization, and effectively the management team and the way the organization is established. And bringing in a practical example, we had one pretty early failure on the first fund, where we assumed way too high a risk on both of those fronts. I was seduced on the product. I seduced on the model one because it was something that nobody else in the fund was proposing to do. Maybe the fact that nobody else was proposing to do it might have been a signal to me that it might not have been sensible. But the model they were going to use, it was around about young people who were disengaged, and this organisation had only previously worked with much younger children, but they were saying that when they went into a house, and they were interesting because they were working with whole families, which was quite an interesting aspect as well, and innovative in a way. But they were saying in most families where they went into where there was younger children, there was often a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old lying on a sofa somewhere, obviously not involved in very much, and they could develop a program there. So it was the referral route that was not quite clear, and we took a chance on it. So we took a chance on the program, but we took a chance on a management team who, to be perfectly frank, they really just wanted the money. They didn't want the engagement. They didn't want the capacity building. They didn't want all of that sort of stuff. And we probably knew that, but we thought we could actually, maybe slightly arrogantly, we thought that they would, when they realized how fantastic we were, that they would want us. And the reality was they didn't. You know, the learning from that was that we took too high a risk on both sides. And I think that where the engagement is great, you can take quite a significant risk on the delivery side, because the model will evolve. And if good people will always find a way to make something happen. That was the learning from that. But you asked also, when do you intervene? We had a process of formal quarterly reviews, on which we then drew down the next tranches of money and so on into those organisations. And you know, it's always, venture philanthropy for me is always about working alongside and trying to leverage all the skills you can, all the abilities, all the capabilities towards making things better. So your first point is always to try and fix it. It's always to try and work and get through. But after 2 years, we decided that the graphs were all heading in the wrong direction. So the exit should have come as no surprise, but it did. Because this particular very large, very politically active, very eminent NGO had never had somebody cancel funding after 2 years of what was a 7-year program we'd set out to have with them. And what then we had to think about was the reputational risk. We both, us and the organisation we funded, realised that it was not going where we wanted it to go. But for us to stop funding was actually going to be hugely important for them to manage that message. So we had to work very hard at a good exit that allowed us both to say positive things. Because the fact that one programme didn't work in a large NGO didn't mean it was a bad NGO. It just didn't work. But it's the way the public perceive those things, and that was challenging also.
Thank you very much. Great comment. I particularly like your question. This is a very important aspect of the venture philanthropy, since that the recipient of the fund also need to put a lot of resource to digest, to utilize that fund for the growth. So that in the due diligence process, it's not, as Shiraishi mentioned, it's not just evaluation from the founder to recipient, but to make alignment of the values and also business plans, and what's the priorities, what the priorities to spend the resources or funds to the growth or the solution, to create a solution to the social issues. So that's important, the part of the due diligence process in the VP model. Okay, thank you. So we have, maybe we can take one last question. Anyone who want to definitely, or maybe we can take two. One on the very back on the left-hand side, and the one gentleman in the middle on the front, please.
All right, I'm Johnson from Scope Group, Malaysia. I'll get straight to the questions. 2 questions. I get the impression that the SIPs, the 2 SIPs, were sort of what I call open type of VPO, whereby you're just on any social impact projects, right? Whereas I think Andrew was saying that it would be good to have very focused on a certain sector. So I was just wondering whether, I mean, maybe you could share some pros and cons of that kind of decision. That's one. And number 2, it also sounds like most of the investments that have been made so far are single SPOs. Have you all had experiences in multi-sector collaboration type of investments, and perhaps you could share some of the challenges and pitfalls. Yeah, because what I have in my head is dealing with a really entrenched issue, and I don't think a single SPO can handle it. So I'm thinking in terms of collective impact. Thank you.
Very good question. So shall we just move to the gentleman on the back, or do we have mic? So the gentleman, the question from the first gentleman is the one of sector focused, and second question is that have we considered any of the collective impact approach to select the investees? Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon rather. My name is Ameya Dabli and I'm from India, from Swadesh Foundation. My question is, when you set up your venture VPOs, what was more difficult to venture into from a perspective of getting in because you wanted to do larger social good, or was it to get better return on investment but from a social space? Is the question clear? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to answer as much of what I got from the questions. In terms of the sector focus, the reason why we have gone with sort of a wider sector focus is because we are actually a very narrowly focused geographically. We're only Hong Kong focused. And taking a step back and giving a bit of background how that came about is, as you have heard in my presentation, one of the objectives of SIP is really to prove the concept of venture philanthropy. And the key element of venture philanthropy that differentiates it from traditional philanthropy is twofold. One, a multi-year financial commitment, and secondly, the development support, the intellectual support. All of that right now for SIP is largely supported by pro bono partners, and those resources are more readily available in hubs like Singapore and Hong Kong. And in terms of a cost, from a cost perspective, we think that we can prove that model more effectively if we can keep it lower cost and more focused in terms of the geography. As a result, we decided that in terms of sector focus that we would keep it wider. The other reason is also, as much as we take into account what our funders and our investors would like SIP to do, the reality is what does the market allow you to do? And the depth of the market in Hong Kong is not that deep. So it's almost, I would say it's, you don't come across thematic, sector focused organizations as beyond sort of a more general youth or education, employability. Beyond that, I think it's difficult. In Andrew's experience in Scotland, I'm always jealous when I hear of his experiences because they have the luxury of being very sector focused or issue focused. I mean, they had a fund that was just specifically on play, which is very narrowly focused. And unfortunately, given the market conditions, the early stage, of where our target market is, that's just not feasible. And to the other gentleman's question on social returns versus financial returns, SIP values the social return more than the financial return, because at the end of the day, it is still a charitable organization. It's a philanthropic venture. We have a Section 88. It's the charitable status in Hong Kong, legal status. So for us, we really would value the social return more than the financial return. Having said that, the sustainability of the fund is also important. In terms of any financial returns that we would get for SIP, that is something that would be recycled back into other projects. And so that allows more mileage with the dollars that we have raised. But it's not the financial return back to the original investors that is what we care about.
Yeah, if I could do the second Amir's question first. I think on a personal level, what I did previously was very much about social gain and social good, because it was donated money, and that's what we worked with. But I have an admiration for the other end of that spectrum, and I think it's a spectrum where you can combine social good alongside financial return. That is a fabulous panacea. I'm not sure that we're quite as far advanced as we think we are in getting to there, but I think it's a very, very good and noble and sensible and sustainable future. I think sometimes I'm concerned in different parts of Asia that you need different forms of capital right the way across a spectrum of social sector organisation, and there's maybe too much capital getting very attracted by the financial and social returns together end of the spectrum, when you actually need that grant funding and soft loan and slightly more relaxed capital and patient capital to move social enterprises to a point where they can be impact investable. So I think where you choose to be in the spectrum from an AVPN perspective is entirely for the fund or the group of people in a fund or so on to decide, and there is no right and wrong answer to that when there's only personal perspectives. But I think the other question, Johnson's question, which again was a really good one around about collaborative platforms. And Lindy, I've got huge admiration for what SIP, in fact, both of the SIPs do. You reflect the market you're in. You reflect the opportunity that you have. And I got an opportunity in setting up our first fund of knowing that there was a significant body of organizations that I could potentially bring into a fund and create that collaborative platform with. And within the baselining work, what we did was we identified 8 different types of intervention that might happen in a young person's life through from 14 to 19, all the way from detached youth work through to supported apprenticeships and various hard skill and soft skill and social issue interventions that might be required. So we built the portfolio to ensure that we had the spectrum of those types of social organisation, so that we built mutual dependency. And also, we built referral route with the potential for young people getting different things along the pathway from there where they were today to potentially a job. So we built that in very much at the outset, a way in which the social sector organisations would become a delivering collaborative and would be mutually dependent on each other.
Yes, similar to commercial business, it is very important to decide what you should not do in view of your core strength, because sometimes we want to do everything you can. And in our case, so we don't do early stage, we don't do overseas, we focus on Japan. We do only the future generation issue. So we do education, childcare, women empowerment in society, and community development. We focus on those sectors. Your second question, in our observation, especially in Japan, those SPOs are quite, specific in their business field. Sometimes they have only one service, single service. And when we consider the total theory of change, some of the leverage point, they should work together. So likewise in the Western countries, I hope there is some consolidation or something healthily in order to make a social impact much bigger between the, those SPOs. Coincidentally, our first investment was after school. Second investment was the Teach for Japan. This is during the school. So how to measure the impact for the beneficiaries, major beneficiaries are children, the good impact, probably synergetic impact between during the school and after school, right? and how to measure those impact or engagement to the children. They are working now together, and after our investment, it happens that the Teach for Japan moved to the new building tenant, and which after school is also resident in. So actually they are in the second floor and the third floor now. It is just happening that kind of case. So those, looking at those scope of the theory of change and how to make a tie-up between the SPOs is also, I think, our BPO's role in the market. Coming to your question about the difficulty, I think yes, it was a difficult. And Doug Miller, who is an old friend of mine, visited Japan many times, and to convince us to set up BPOs. And I think that's a key thing was only to start a VP is passion and money. And also skill, like our skill of the venture capital skill or legal skill, management consultant skill. And the fourth thing is a platform. So if somebody has a good catalyst to start that kind of things, to collaborate those resources, then I think it's not sometimes difficult to set up a BPO. Because I have been in the commercial investment for the many years, but when I talked to Nippon Foundation, we thought, we have been looking at the same thing.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers and comments. And I particularly think that this is an important aspect, think about collective impact. Since that the venture philanthropy industry started from the private equity or venture capital industry. So initially they tend to look at the growth of one business. It is kind of natural because of their investors' point of view. But eventually everybody realized that how to develop an ecosystem is more important. So that's why we are so much into how to influence the government policy, or how to create the value chain, the change in the value chain itself, involving in the different part of the chain to make a social change. Among the yesterday's presentation, maybe you can take a look at the one of my colleagues from Japan, Kamonohashi project on page 12 on the brochure, and they are taking a collective impact approach to tackle with the human trafficking issues. Okay, so I'm sorry that this session starts late and finished late, but I hope that everybody enjoyed the session. For those who are considering to set up a VPO, that we have a resource person here for the potential consulting work, advisory work, and we have accumulation of knowledge and experience and case studies. So please come to us. We can work together to develop a new VP fund, anywhere in Asia. And for those who are in the industry, I hope this session works as a recapture of your understanding to refresh your the recognition that how to utilize this model to make maximize social impact. Okay, so thank you again for these four panelists, and that's it for today's session. Thank you very much.